Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kende. I'm a senior fellow at the Graduate Institute, and welcome to the third session of our conference Data 2025. We're going to be talking in this panel about the principles of data governance. This morning, we had quite a few discussions about digital trust and how digital trust issues surround the gathering and use of data. And in particular, in the last panel, we talked about the COVID contract tracing app, which is just not that widely used. Here in Switzerland, only 22% of the population are using it, despite the obvious benefits that it can bring. And when they asked people why they weren't using it, the number one reason that they said was they were concerned about data protection. But the app has significant privacy protection built in, totally anonymous. It just uses numbers. There's no centralization of data. And it shows that technology is a critical part of the solution, but not the only part of the solution. You need a broader data governance to develop digital trust. And it's particularly difficult with data because while data has significant value, it's very unique among items of value. There's the old analogy that data is the new oil because oil powered the industrial economy and data powers the digital economy. But that's not really a great analogy, and I think that that could be discussed at length. But all I'll say is that oil, it has to be consumed to generate value. It can only be consumed once, and it's not renewable. Data is not like gold that you can hold and you know it's there and then you can spend it and it's a physical item. And it's not even like money in the bank, which is virtual in a sense, and it can be lent out to others. But you can always find out how much you have. You can always take it out, and there's insurance in case anything goes wrong with a bank. On the other hand, with data, it's intangible. We don't know where it is. The same data about us can be used in multiple places at the same time. It's also generative, that the value can increase through usage. The more it's used, it can create positive value. It can increase in value. But it's difficult to know how it's being used and if it's just being used for good or if it's also being used for purposes that we might not want. So to generate trust, data governance is has to have a multi-stakeholder model. It can't be up to any one stakeholder to develop, implement, and monitor. We need civil society to help develop a framework of good practice and represent us as users. We need governments to implement and enforce a framework and represent us as citizens. And we need companies to develop technology and data practices that develop trust, because ultimately the companies are developing the equipment and they're gathering data and using it along with others. So I'm very happy we have speakers that have joined us to discuss each of the different stakeholder perspectives, and then we'll go to questions and answers from the audience. Please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And our first speaker is my former colleague, Robin Wilton, the Senior Advisor for Internet Trust at the Internet Society. Robin?
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. As you just said, my work at the Internet Society is about the internet and trust. And some of that is on the basis for why we trust the internet. And some of it is about the basis for why we trust the online services that we get to on the internet. So what I would like to talk very briefly about in my opening remarks today is the relationship between trust, the ethical handling of data, and encryption as a technical protection for that data. So every time we go online, and also in fact in much of what we do offline, we rely on the good behavior of third parties. Every time you connect, you rely on the good behavior of your internet service provider, maybe your mobile provider. You rely on the good behavior of the websites you visit and the social media that you use, because they all collect data about you. They all process data about you. And if they do that in a disrespectful way, your interests can be harmed. And that has a bearing on trust. But what do I mean by trust? Well, a definition that I use is that trust is a belief that someone else will act in our interest, even if they have an opportunity and a motivation to do otherwise. What happens there is that, like any belief, once you start thinking of trust as a belief, like any other belief, trust can be well-founded or it can be poorly founded. Sometimes trust's based on past experience or behavior. Sometimes it relies on a little technical help. So for instance, there was a famous bank robber called Willie Sutton, who made the headlines at one point because he allegedly said, when someone said to him, "Why do you rob banks, Willie?" And he said, "Well, because that's where the money is." And if I think, so what do I trust Willie Sutton? Well, if I believe that Willie Sutton won't steal my wallet, do I believe that because he's locked up or because I think he's a good person? So am I really trusting Willie Sutton, or am I trusting the jail to do its job? Am I relying on his behavior and my experience of it? Or am I relying on some more technical kind of protection, like the things that keep him in jail? So as I say, everything we do online is mediated through third parties. Much of what we do offline is mediated through third parties. If you're captured on CCTV as you walk down the high street, when we're allowed to walk down the high street again, then of course you're not doing anything, but you're relying on the trust of whoever it is who captures and processes that data. So even things that we don't do online give rise to online trust issues. The next principle I want to cover very briefly is this idea that technology is somehow ethically neutral. And that's something that I thought for a long time. I thought, well, technology is neutral. It's what you do with it that has an ethical dimension. And I was kindly corrected by someone who's devoted a lot more thought to this than I have, Sarah Spiekermann at the Economic University of Vienna. And she pointed out to me that technology is not ethically neutral. Technology is the consequence of a process. And at each stage in that process of development, you have an ethical choice. So by the time technology reaches you, the user, it's the consequence of a number of ethical choices. And that means it's not inherently ethically neutral. But the good news is that process of making decisions at each point in the development of technology means that ethical judgments can be integrated into the development process systematically and throughout the data lifecycle. Anna will have something to say later, I'm sure, about data controllers and the decisions they make in the development of their processes and products. But while privacy and security and confidentiality are all parts of the same cloud of things, they're technically related, but they're not the same thing. So the next thing I want to look at very briefly is confidentiality. If you talk to an information security specialist or a data security specialist about the threats to data, they will typically show you a 2x2 matrix. They'll say that the attackers who are trying to get at your data take four types. They're either active or passive. In other words, if they're passive, they're just trying to read the data. If they're active, they're trying to change it. And they're either insiders or outsiders. They might be tapping a phone line, in which case they're a passive outsider attacker. Or they might be someone in the data center who is abusing their legitimate access to get into people's account records and change them. Then they'd be an active insider. So there's this 2x2 matrix, active or passive, insider or outsider. And the ones that scare the IT security folks most are active insiders, because they have access, they can read and modify data, and in principle, sometimes they can do it without leaving a trace. Now, there are some technical protections against all those forms of attack, and encryption underpins several of them. So for example, take the simple one, a passive outsider attack, someone tapping a phone line. If the data on the phone line is encrypted, the passive outsider attacker can see the data, but they can't understand it. So there's an important little nuance. Encryption doesn't stop someone from getting at your data, but it stops them from understanding what it is that they're seeing. And that nuance is important because it separates confidentiality on the one hand from access controls on the other. And clearly, if what you're trying to protect against is an active attacker, you really need access control as well. So the picture starts to build up. There's no single service that protects your data, but you have to apply the services depending on the kind of attack that you're protecting against. Now, those protections are under threat because a number of governments, in the name of law enforcement, are proposing that we should not have access to strong, reliable encryption that puts, as they say, data beyond the reach of a warrant. Now, let's look at that from two perspectives. The first one is session level encryption. So when I use my browser to visit a website, and I make sure I check that it's using HTTPS, not HTTP, that means that the session between the browser and the website is encrypted. At either end of that session, the data is in the clear. If it weren't in the clear, I wouldn't be able to read it in my browser, and that wouldn't be very useful. So session level encryption works like a secure pipeline. Anyone trying to look into that pipeline while the data is moving through it sees only nonsense. They see only encrypted data. But both the parties at either end see the data in clear. So session level encryption protects the confidentiality, and if it's done properly, the integrity of the data between you and the server. Everything is clear on the client and also in the server. And the metadata, the data that says who connected to which server at what time and from where, is in clear anyway, because otherwise it can't be routed correctly through the network. So that's the first perspective. The second perspective is end-to-end encryption. And here we're talking not just about a connection, say, between a browser and a web server, but a message between two parties. And like all the other services that I mentioned at the outset, that messaging service is mediated. It goes via a messaging service like WhatsApp or Signal. So what happens there is, if it's end-to-end encrypted, the integrity and confidentiality of my message is protected from the time it leaves my device until the recipient opens it. Even the service in the middle can't read that data because it's encrypted there too. If you don't have end-to-end encryption, there's no technical guarantee of confidential communication. Because for all the other kinds, the session level encryption, your data is always popping out in clear at the intermediary. And so you have to trust the intermediary, you have to rely on their good behavior. And so in terms of trust in the internet and trust in online services, it's really important that we understand the distinction between session level encryption and end-to-end encryption, what end-to-end encryption is delivering, and why it's important that we should retain our right to confidential communication against the kind of policy that seeks to undermine it. And that's all I will say for the moment. Thanks again, Michael, for the invitation, and I look forward to hearing what my two colleagues on the panel have to say next.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Anna Buchta, the head of the unit Policy and Consultation at the European Data Protection Supervisor. Anna?
Good afternoon, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to take part in today's discussion with a very rich agenda and the broad range of topics to choose from to discuss this issue of trust online. I think you have already touched on the issue to what extent we rely nowadays on data flowing through pipes or otherwise in cyberspace that underpin increasingly our day-to-day lives and our work-related activities, even more so nowadays since the pandemic crisis hit than in the past. And it's also true that well, we remember that the issue of trust and how to create it, and also the statements to what extent trust, citizens' trust, consumer trust, you name it, underpins the development of those modern technologies and services and are a condition for their success has been stressed by data protection authorities quite often in the past as well. And we also had various Eurobarometer surveys or Pew Internet Research and other jurisdictions than Europe showing times and again that individuals will not really fully buy into this brave new online world without reassurances, without trusting that their fundamental freedoms will not suffer as a consequence. And then we also have had our share of scandals related to the use of data, disclosures. I will not go all the way back to the Snowden disclosures, but that was obviously a watershed moment for, let's say, the global community, largely perhaps losing its innocence over what it implies when we all rely on the internet as the main medium of communication worldwide. Later on, we had Cambridge Analytica, various hacking incidents. And so I think that as a result of all that, it also seems that at least in Europe, the answer to the trust dilemma increasingly seems to be regulation. At the same time, you might say if you hold a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So from a data protection regulator to focus on regulation, it shouldn't possibly come as a surprise. But it is my impression that today, at least in the EU, we are no longer discussing how to go about self-regulation, co-regulation, trust promotion in a different, in a multi-stakeholder setting without at the same time, in the same breath, discussing regulation. And so my message to you or to our audience today would be that this is where I see most of the developments, the relevant developments happening in the coming months and years. And I don't mean by that only and exclusively data protection laws, even though obviously we have those in Europe. We have had them since the 1970s. Also, by the way, in the United States, it started in 1974 with the Federal Privacy Act. But today we have, I believe, over 230 jurisdictions worldwide with some form of generally applicable data privacy rules on the books. In the EU, it seems that the GDPR was needed to really focus minds and raise awareness of many of the underlying principles which were in place even before, at least since the old directive. But maybe now, thanks to the stronger enforcement framework and the creation of the European Data Protection Board, perhaps we are about to move closer from the theory or from the law on the books to reality. But there is more to it than just data protection. So in the EU, as you probably know, we also have since about 2 years a separate legal framework for the free movement and free circulation of non-personal data. We could, of course, also discuss at length where the distinction lies between the two, but it just shows that that the regulator in Europe has already moved beyond regulating only personal data and how it should be used and how it should be governed. We've had for many, many years legislation mandating release to the public or allowing public use of data held by the public sector that has been also updated and upgraded in recent years in the form of the Open Data Directive. And now the EU will be moving even further to creating the so-called data spaces as an implementation of the European Commission data strategy. announced early this year. And here we see that the idea of creating an institutional governance framework in order to provide assurances to all the stakeholders involved, including the public, of course, but also the entities holding the data, the entities who will be using the data, and indeed also governments and regulators, that their competences will be safeguarded and the laws will be complied with, are a very important consideration. So just to say that in the coming weeks, if not days, actually, the Commission is scheduled to present its proposal for the European data governance regulation, I believe it's going to be, which is expected to propose a kind of governance framework, hopefully based on the involvement of various stakeholders, to go about the creation of the future data spaces. And then if we understand it correctly, in the coming weeks and months, so in practice in next year, we will see a number of sectoral instruments that will follow up with specific rules for the particular European data spaces that will be put in place to allow this kind of data sharing for the public good, for the general good. In this context, we as EDPS, as the advisor to the European Commission and to EU institutions, have been looking in particular at the future forthcoming European health data space. And well, there are various reasons. One is quite obvious. Traditionally, well, health data is or the data that is interesting in the context of data sharing and healthcare in general, most of that qualifies obviously as personal data, and even more as special categories of personal data due to its sensitive nature. And so this kind of data are subject to specific legal regime. But obviously there is now a renewed sense of urgency, also because of the pandemic and because of the necessity that has been shown already to try and push for the reuse of this type of data at European level, and to a certain extent even at global level. Obviously, without scientific research data sharing at quite a large scale, progress towards finding a successful vaccine would not be possible within the timeframes that we are now all discussing. So for all these reasons, we have been looking at what might be expected, what might be coming our way in relation to the health data spaces in particular, and we have published only last week an EDPS opinion on the forthcoming Commission initiative. So it's not in response to any specific legal proposal, because it's too early. We don't have those yet. But there, indeed, we are already putting forward some elements which we believe will be necessary to indeed foster the general trust in this kind of initiative, and to allow for a successful establishment of such a future regime. So here, just very quickly, of course, it's about a strong mechanism that would be clear, that would be legally binding, that would provide to all stakeholders sufficient assurances of a future lawful and ethical data sharing, data reuse. As I mentioned, it should encompass all stakeholders, not just the public authorities, but obviously also those entities that will be sharing the data, that will be using or reusing the data, other stakeholders as well in appropriate formats. And here, obviously, the role of data protection authorities and ensuring compliance with existing rules for personal data processing is something that is very close to our hearts as regulators. So this is what we what we also write about extensively in that opinion. So just to sum up at this stage, I would say that the real challenge for the future might indeed be how to effectively enforce the rules which we already have. There is a lot, and with proper enforcement, I think that would greatly contribute to creating the public trust, to reassuring citizens that indeed, for example, in relation to the COVID applications or the contact tracing applications that were mentioned earlier, in many jurisdictions across Europe at EU level, so much work has gone into ensuring compliance, and even more than compliance with existing rules, ensuring that these applications are put in place with data protection and privacy in mind, including privacy enhancing technologies, data minimization, security, and all that. So it would be really a pity if somehow public perception of these things would hamper their effective and efficient use. So first challenge, how to effectively enforce the regulations which we already have, including in cross-border settings, and not only within Europe, but also more broadly. And then how to make those different regulatory frameworks work seamlessly together without undermining the level playing field and while enhancing legal certainty for all stakeholders. So I would leave it at that for the moment and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Obviously, there's a lot on your plate and at the EU level, and we'll talk about that in a moment. First, to discuss developing corporate trust, Jean-Yves Art, the Senior Director for Strategic Partnerships at Microsoft. Jean-Yves?
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, and I'm very, very pleased to be with you on this virtual conference, which is a conference on a very important topic. I have to say that when I was looking at the topic, I was wondering why we were talking about 2025 rather than 2020, because it is an important topic today. When we talk about data governance and trust in the corporate sphere, I think that trust in data in the corporate sphere really relies on four main pillars. And the four main pillars for me are privacy, number one, security, number two, and then transparency and accountability. As far as privacy is concerned, I'll tell you a little bit what we do on those four principles, bearing in mind that I know what we're doing. I have less information about others are doing, but I'm always open to discuss different or more advanced approaches to those four different topics that I just mentioned. As far as privacy is concerned, as we all know, we have moved from a situation where we were talking about notice and consent to a situation where, pursuant to the GDPR, which we regard as a very modern privacy regulation, really apt for the data era in which we live, we are now more in terms of access and control, which is being given to customers. While there are differences between the privacy regulations that apply in countries, and numbers were given earlier today in this session about those different privacy regulations, I can tell you that when we at Microsoft have been early supporters of the GDPR, so that when it entered into force, we decided to apply it on a global scale, so that all the benefits that come to consumers and users from the GDPR are available worldwide. Now, we think that we can do more than give access and control. And especially when you talk about privacy, privacy is very much a right which individuals have and want to enforce in front of or in relationship to government authorities. And therefore, for us, privacy goes beyond even access and control. Privacy is also, at least for corporations, the way we deal with requests for access to user data when those requests are made to us by law enforcement agencies or by national security agencies. Because we have been faced with those requests pretty early on in our digital times, I think we have developed a practice to really protect the consumer and the user data from those requests. I think the way we see it is that the data belongs to customers, and therefore, rather than come to Microsoft to get access to the customer data, we think that law enforcement agencies, including also national security agencies, should go first to the users and ask for their data. And if that is not possible, then we would want to make sure that the way in which the request comes to us is something which has been which is safe and which is sound from a legal perspective. So that is, in our view, main elements of privacy. It is this access and control pursuant to the GDPR, which in our view is, as I said, a modern regulation on the protection of data, but it is also beyond and above giving access and control to users. It is also a way for us to defend consumer data from requests which are put by law enforcement agencies and national security agencies, even when it comes to going to court in order to enforce the rights of consumers. This being said, there is one point which I think is important also to emphasize when you talk about privacy, and especially when tech companies talk about privacy. I mean, the thing that we always say is, privacy is a journey. It's never the end. It's always possible to improve. Just as well, it's always possible, to miss the point and to make mistakes. And that's why we say, okay, we need to do the best we can to protect the user data, but realize that this is something which is a journey. It's rather an endpoint, and everybody complying with that. Second pillar of building corporate trust is around security, ensuring that the data that we get from consumers is securely stored and can be securely processed by the users. Again, here, we think that it is a combination of technology and practice. The technology part is, for instance, making sure that the user data is not stored in a single data center, but this data is replicated over several data centers, at least 2 data centers, if possible in different countries, so that the data is always secure. I mean, you can always retrieve the data that has been provided by the customers. In terms of practices, then, in order to ensure more security to the data, or to user data, things that we do is always monitor the activities that are taking place on our network, activities that are taking place around our data centers, and I try to identify suspect activities and take action against suspect activities. Things that we've been doing regularly and keep doing regularly is identify hackers and sometimes nation-state hackers or hackers sponsored by nation-states when they use infrastructure to get into our network to steal identity from users and to get access to those users' data or users' mailboxes, for instance. So there too, I mean, it's a question of identifying the hackers, bringing them to court, getting court orders so that we can disrupt, take control over the infrastructure which those hackers are using. And beyond that, and that's something which I think Anna referred to at some point, it's also a question of improving the legal regime, improving the laws that exist and trying to move beyond and push them to the next limit. That is why we have for several years now, and we keep working with regulatory authorities and governments to improve the security laws that exist. We participate, for instance, in UNGGE and open-ended working group processes at the UN level on that side. I move to the third pillar, the one about transparency, which is, in my view, really a key element in building trust, the trust that users can have to companies. The more transparent the companies are, especially with respect to their practices regarding privacy and security, the more trust you can create. Transparency when it comes to privacy is first a matter of having dashboards which indicate clearly what data has been collected from users, where the data is, how it is used, and what users can do with the data, sometimes in accordance with national law, which is the case in the EU, sometimes applying the rules which are given by certain regulations to users outside of those jurisdictions. And that was the case with the GDPR. Transparency on privacy is the dashboard, but it goes also beyond giving a dashboard. It can be, and that relates to a point I was making about privacy as protection against requests for access to data. Things that we do, for instance, are to publish every 6 months a report which lists the number of cases in which we have had law enforcement agencies coming to us and requesting access to customer data, and what we have done when we got those requests. And we do the same thing also with respect to security, where we have now started to publish, and we did this first time this year in 2020, a digital defense report, which does a little bit the same thing as requests for access to data, but which lists the attacks that we have seen on our infrastructure, the number of attacks, the techniques which are used by hackers, the categories of targets, human rights defenders, and other non-government organizations, and of course try to draw learnings from the number of attacks, the targets, and the techniques that have been used. That's why we've been very public about that when we have seen a number of attacks coming from 3 countries in particular, Russia, Iran, and China, as well as, I should say, North Korea. These are things that we make very public, and we think that making this public, making transparent the number of attacks, the techniques that are used, and the targets contributes to building the trust in the companies. Last point, which of course is also very important when you talk about building trust between users as companies, is accountability. Accountability for privacy, accountability for privacy breaches, and also accountability for security and security incidents. Accountability for privacy and privacy breaches, well, again, one of the interesting developments that came from GDPR was sanctions that were provided for by the GDPR, but we are bringing this accountability, principle of accountability beyond GDPR, and also we have committed to provide monetary compensation when we disclose information in a way which is not consistent with the GDPR, even when we do this in response to a law enforcement agency request. So when the request is coming from a foreign government. So that's in our view how to articulate the cloud and Article 48 of the GDPR. Another field in which we are trying to be accountable to our customers is also in the field of security. There, though, I should say that security is something where we haven't talked a lot about it, but there are really multiple actors that are being involved in ensuring the security of the data when it rests and when it's given to corporate and digital tech companies. And of course, that the company should be accountable for the security of its products. But what we have seen is that security is also sometimes a matter of, and not sometimes, in fact, security is also a matter of the user behavior, the way users practice. We've seen, for instance, that based on what we see, over 60% of users do not always take the best security practices which exist. These days, everybody is talking about multi-factor authentication, where you can get access to a website from your computer. You need to enter your code, and you get access to the website. The website sends you a PIN code on your cell phone, so smartphone, not a PC, and then you have to enter the code into the web page in order to get access to that. So there is today multi-factor authentication. Sometimes not everybody is implementing that, not everybody is doing this, and we think that that's where also accountability has to come into play. Again, security is really many stakeholders can contribute to increase security, whether it's the tech companies, the users, website developers, and everybody should contribute and be effective in doing that. Now, to conclude this first part of our panel, what I would say is that, as you can gather from this presentation, trust is really a combination of the various factors that I was mentioning, the privacy, security, transparency, and accountability. But I think more importantly, trust is something which is built on the relationship between companies and their customers. It's not something which goes, you do one way only, and trust comes from what the company is doing to the customers. It is really something where the users and the customers have also, in our view, to do their part of the journey and contribute to building this trust, because very often the way to build the trust is by giving opportunities to users, and then for them to take advantage of those opportunities. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions which you or the audience may have.
Okay, thanks very much. I think that was quite rich. I'll just ask one round of questions, and then I see some questions coming in. I mean, we're talking about this multi-stakeholder model, and I just wanted to get each of your reactions to what the other said, because everyone has a role. Robin was talking about encryption, which we can do ourselves, companies can do, governments clearly have a view on encryption as well. Anna suggested that regulation should maybe take a bit more of a role, and outlined a few things that are going to happen in Europe on top of the GDPR. And Jean-Yves talked about the role of companies and what Microsoft in particular is doing, welcoming the GDPR, building on that. And we'll talk about users and what they can do maybe in a bit. But I just wondered, starting with you, Robin, if you could just reflect a little bit on what you heard and what the role of the different stakeholders is.
Yes, the Internet Society is a great proponent of the multi-stakeholder model. We like it everywhere. We like it for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner. And I think there's validity in that. When you look at data governance, I mean, I've taken part in a number, for example, of OECD workshops on open data and data governance. And one of the insights that I drew from one of those workshops was that through the data lifecycle for personal data, a lot of value is created, but very little of that value eventually makes its way back to the data subject. This chain always seems to lead somewhere else. And so I think that points to a failure to represent adequately the interests of at least one set of stakeholders here, and that's the data subject. Looking more specifically at the encryption side of this, again, we're in a product lifecycle that has many participants. And if we think back to one of the recent incidents, there was a crypto toolkit that made it into the market with a default setting that ensured that the random number generator it used was not particularly reliable, not particularly strong. And there was a vendor of that product, and the product had been discussed by some security agencies. They'd given their input, and yet it still made it into the market with this somewhat weak, suboptimal default setting. So what that said to me was, there's a product life cycle here, and a supply chain which we need to pay more attention to, because things went through that whole life cycle and through the product supply chain, and still ended up on the market with serious flaws in. So one of the things that that the Internet Society helped with through the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, was to look at ways in which we could improve trust in the product supply chain, specifically for encryption hardware. And that raised a really interesting set of problems. Just to give one quick example, we decided that the architecture for a cryptographic hardware device should be developed on a basis that it uses standard, generic, off-the-shelf chips and computer components. Nothing specialized in there. Because as soon as you introduce specialization, you narrow it down to a smaller subset of producers, and therefore you introduce risk into the supply chain. The broader your range of possible suppliers for default vanilla chips and components, the harder it is for someone to subvert that supply chain. So it was, to me, somewhat unexpected, but a very interesting look at trust through the supply chain, the development process.
Great, thank you, Anna.
Thank you, with pleasure. Well, actually, I couldn't agree more with Robin on both points of involving or giving a voice to data subjects, and then also on the need to involve or to have the technical expertise on board when discussing about both governance framework and in particular regulation. So on data subjects, actually that also came to my mind listening to Jean-Yves, and there obviously, I mean, we recognize the efforts being put into place by Microsoft in various areas to ensure compliance and to roll it out worldwide without, you know, discussing nitty-gritty details of to what extent GDPR applies, Article 3.2, etc. At the same time, when you talk about, you know, empowering customers, transparency towards customers, you know, obviously customers and data subjects and users are not always the same thing, and so there is always, I believe, still some tension, also including between some corporate programs and maybe the focus of legislation such as GDPR and even ethical arguments, how to really empower the individual and how to make all this work. So absolutely, I think this focus on data subjects, about whose data we are actually talking about, to the extent it's personal data, is very legitimate one. And one angle to look at that could indeed be to analyze the value created on this basis, and maybe why not try to find a way to pass part of this value, monetary or otherwise, to the individual. Even though here I should immediately make a footnote to say that this is an issue which is hotly debated also among the data protection authorities. And we are discussing with the European Commission where, you know, the ideas for so-called PIMs or private personal identity management systems or private data vaults, etc., has been around for quite some time. The Commission is very keen on doing something to the extent they could to support the development of this kind of innovative business models. But at the same time, there is also a certain degree of uneasiness on the regulator side. I should mention that, because after all, well, they feel we are discussing inherent human rights or fundamental rights, as we call it in Europe. So it sometimes feels a bit awkward to discuss very explicitly monetization or you know, paying people for the use of their fundamental rights in economic terms. Nevertheless, I'm sure the discussion will continue, and I would personally think that this offers many promising avenues to involve, to bring individuals, data subjects on board. And just very briefly, on the other point, absolutely tech expertise and explanations and understanding of the different nuances. This is dearly lacking in many of the discussions that we are having. Encryption and the somewhat unfortunate discussions that we have, the draft council conclusions and various other documents. And we have seen it as data protection authorities also since the Schrems II judgment, and in the development of the EDPB recommendations on so-called supplementary measures, where encryption features now prominently, but it took a lot of effort unpacking this, and what encryption does under what circumstances, end-to-end versus this kind of, HTTPS type of security or confidentiality protection. So quite often, I'm afraid, regulators and lawmakers are a bit lost without technical expertise being always present, and it's not always easy to sort this all out when we are discussing mainly among lawyers. So these two groups definitely need to be involved early on in the process, I would say.
Great, thank you. Jean-Yves?
Yeah, very briefly, because for two reasons. First, I've to some extent discussed that aspect of the multi-stakeholderism in building trust through my initial comments, but also because I think that both what Robin and Anna have just said covers largely the topic. I think building trust and creating trust is something which is very much a multi-stakeholder journey, or the multi-stakeholder relies on multi-stakeholder approach. You see this, for instance, from the perspective of security. When you can always develop good tools, but tools are rarely absolutely perfect. You can have loopholes, and then it's improved, and you issue patches. The patches work provided they are installed, and therefore, and you could say the same thing with privacy. Privacy, GDPR again gives absolutely fantastic rights to users. You need to be aware of those rights. You need to know how to exercise those rights. And therefore, from my perspective, yes, multi-stakeholderism is absolutely key. It's absolutely fundamental. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I think that where we should absolutely improve is on information. We need to provide more information about what exists, what are the rights, what are the tools, and how to make them. And I'm to some extent, that's what we try to do with the dashboard, make it easy for users to understand where the data is, how we use it, and the rights which they have with this. But it's not an easy task. And when I see also what the situation on the side of security, the fact that we see a large number of users not implementing security patches that we have, updates that we make available even for free. So there is really a lot of information that needs to go among those different stakeholders in order to optimize the features, the measures beyond the technology features. It's also all the measures that we regulators, technology companies, sometimes civil society is asking for in order to improve privacy, in order to improve security. A lot of information. For me, that is really what is important.
Thank you very much. I have many more questions, but we have some from the audience, so I'll turn to those, and maybe we'll have time for another one at the end. But from Atul Kaushik, sorry if I didn't get that, to Robin, is it technically possible for a hacker working through an insider on the pipeline to decipher end-to-end encrypted data? That is a question some regulators are asking technical authorities.
Yeah, thanks, Atul. It's a really good question because it raises some of the core issues here. If we put the word hacker to one side for the moment, it's absolutely the case that some governments are asking to be added to encrypted conversations. So, for example, some governments are asking to be added to WhatsApp groups in such a way that they can read the messages between the other participants, not necessarily intervene, but read the data that's exchanged. So what's happening there is not so much hacking as a government requesting that the key management for those end-to-end encrypted sessions be changed so that someone other than the intended participants in the group gets one of the keys. And second, so at that point, what the government is asking for is to be a passive insider. Yeah, they're asking to be given one of the keys so that they can read the data that's going past. But there's a further and more worrying aspect to that, which is that if you set up a group in an encrypted chat service, you want to be notified reliably every time someone joins the group. Otherwise, you don't know if your group is confidential or not. So if Jean-Yves, Anna, and I are in a WhatsApp group and Michael joins, we all get a message saying Michael joined the group. If we don't get that message and Michael is able to join as a silent listener, our conversation is no longer confidential because it no longer includes only those people who we invited to join. It's got a silent listener and we're not aware of that. So that further change, the suppression of the message to the other participants that someone new has joined the group, is a very worrying function to ask for because it undermines the core purpose of a confidential chat group. There's a further twist to that, which is that if Jean-Yves, Anna, and I are in our confidential group and one of us gets a new phone, for example. So Anna, no, actually, I'll use mine because I did drop it the other day. I dropped my phone. It doesn't work. Actually, the cat knocked it off the table, but that's a whole other story. So I have to get a new phone, but I'm still a valid member of the group with Jean-Yves and Anna. So I get my new phone and I join the group again on a new device. That device doesn't have the keys that I had on my old device. So Jean-Yves and Anna have to be sent a reliable notice that I have joined the group again. And I've got some new keys. Again, if a government wants to add a silent listener, it has to have the option of suppressing that message. Because otherwise, when it joins, Anna and Jean-Yves will be told, these new keys have been added to your keychain. So it can't have that. And again, the implication for that is, if it's possible for someone to join a group and not get a key rollover message, or if it's possible for someone to replace a device and not get a key rollover message, the confidentiality of the group is fundamentally undermined. So, as I say, setting aside whether you call that hacking or not, yes, it is possible to add people to encrypted chats because that's what governments are asking for. And yes, it's a really bad idea because it compromises functions in the product that are core to its purpose.
Okay, thank you, Robin. There was a question for Jean-Yves. Does Microsoft share its data with researchers in any fields? And particularly with respect to this, how does it do so securely and while ensuring the privacy of its users?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I do not know the full big company. I don't know how many partners we have, and we don't. What I can tell you is that when we enter into data sharing agreements, as we do from time to time, as we have done recently in the context of our Open Data Initiative, it is clear that we're not sharing user data. We share the data, public data, or data that we have available, for instance, from our AI on Earth program about the observations that we make around nature. I mean, this is the kind of data that we are going to share. We don't share our user data. I mean, it's something it's data that belongs to our customers.
Thank you. Another question for all three of you from Derek with a follow-on from Alexandre. What is your view on decentralized models of governance? For example, decentralized ledger technologies like blockchain, and how can they remain decentralized so they foster trustworthy polycentric governance? Anyone? Robin?
Yeah, sure. I can make a brief comment on that because I sat in on a really interesting DLT workshop at UNECA in Addis Ababa a couple of years ago. And one of the problems that the participants in the workshop were keenest to solve was the problem of property and land registries in various nations in Africa, because they were perceived as being ripe for corruption, and someone would buy a house, move in, and then someone else would turn up the next day with an apparently valid deed to the property and say, actually, you have to move out because this is mine. And there was great optimism about distributed ledger technologies being the solution to this, because that way you've got a single property register and whatever's on there is the definitive version. And what they didn't seem to be paying too much attention to was the fact that it's strictly a garbage in, garbage out process here. If there's still corruption at the point where things get put on the blockchain, then corruption persists and all you've done is give it a permanent record. So the technology is an interesting part of this, but it doesn't actually solve the whole problem. You need appropriate governance mechanisms about how things get onto the blockchain if you're going to treat that as the authoritative source. And one sort of closing sentence on that. When distributed ledger technologies talk about consensus, they use that term in a very specific technical way. They don't mean consensus the way that we would mean it amongst a group of humans. So if you're expecting a DLT to deliver the consensus of the people subscribed to it, you have to be really careful and look into that a bit more closely.
Great point. Anna or Jean-Yves? No, okay. So Jean-Yves, you're right. We definitely don't want to suggest that there are no issues today in 2020. And we started to plan this pre-COVID, and one of the very few side benefits was that the last panel focused on COVID and provided some insights on the COVID tracking and things like that. But looking forward, how do you see the balance between stakeholders going within countries or regions, and then maybe fracturing or agreement across countries? So Jean-Yves, you've said Microsoft is adopting GDPR everywhere, and so that those protections hold. But Anna, there's the privacy shield and the other issues that are to some degree rupturing that. Then there's just the whole question of different stakeholders having different primacy in different regions. So I just wondered if you'd like to comment on kind of looking forward, what the roles are going to be between and among stakeholders in different regions. Should we go backwards? Jean-Yves, do you want to?
Yes, sure. It's a very, very, very good question. It requires that you try to think a little bit ahead of where things are going. And for me, I'm just giving you really my personal views on this. I think what's going on is that we are really at the beginning of what people are calling a new industrial revolution. And we are in the very first stages. We realize what is important, what is necessary in order to succeed in this new industrial revolution, the importance of the data. And yet at the same time, we also realize, and when I say we, it's based on your question, it's mainly governments that realize the importance of the data, the need to protect it, the need to safeguard certain types of data. So I think that, and we see this with, of course, the development of what's called the sovereign clouds, as discussions that are taking place here in Switzerland at the moment. What are we going to do? So the way I see it is that we are going to find the right balance, between sharing the data and keeping data maybe inside the country. To some extent, you could say that we've seen the same in the enterprise world between those enterprises which have built, in fact, hybrid clouds, keeping data on-premise and putting data in the cloud. I think that we could see the same kind of thinking and development when it comes to public information, to the information which is collected by governments, and we'll have to I think when I say we, again, it's governments will have to find the right balance between realizing that it's important to share data because it's also a way for them to get access to the data and access to data of others that enable them to be more effective, more competitive, more up to date in the development of new technologies which serve their population and at the same time keep the data confidential when that is important to safeguard the rights of their own population.
Thank you. Anna?
I'm having a little bit of a background noise here. I don't know if that's, can you hear that? If that's not a problem, I can continue. Okay, perfect. Apologies for that. It has to happen at least once in every webinar. Either a kid barging in or something else. Anyway, I think I fully agree that balance is probably the operative word here. Yes, it's true that in Europe in particular, we have a lot of discussions about data sovereignty and maybe a degree of data localization coming into play. But to me, this is more about rebalancing indeed than anything else. So I think according to the different statistics that have been quoted to me, apparently between 85% and 95% of European data is stored, processed by the big US cloud providers. And so I think, you know, even the most free flow of data oriented policymaker has to realize at some point that maybe something needs precisely a degree of rebalancing here. Well, we mentioned the issue of the US and transfers and Privacy Shield, but there again, to me, this is yet another instance after so many other iterations previously where now the Court of Justice for the second time said that indeed, you know, if the US wants to continue to play this role of a global hub, including for European private data, then, you know, a minimum of safeguards need to be provided, including by law. And so I think this is again, at some point, going to be a choice for the US government and lawmakers, whether or not, you know, they are prepared to finally, after all these years, to make some concessions, or whether they are happy to live with a greater degree of data localization and, you know, people moving away from the US cloud. But in any event, I think that for what concerns regulators and data protection authorities, the global dialogue and collaboration continues and even intensifies. What used to be called, you know, quite an obscure yearly meeting of International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners now has been rebranded into a Global Privacy Assembly, and this is you know, a body that really tries to modernize itself now. Unfortunately, this year the plans to have a proper international conference with the participation of stakeholders, which is the tradition, has been jeopardized by the pandemic. But we all do hope that we will be able to pick this dialogue up also with external stakeholders from next year. And finally, I think in terms of civil society, we see, well, obviously, you know, civil society interested in privacy and data protection in Europe is not new. but we see a lot of this interest also in other jurisdictions, and let me just point to the developments in certain states in the US, notably in California, where the data privacy law, which is now there on the books, actually started as a private initiative of one particular citizen businessman, Alistair McTaggart, who actually this year followed up with another proposition, adding more rights and more protections to the existing statute. So, you know, depending on legal systems, obviously things have to play out differently and follow different rules. But I would say that across the world, you know, the concerns are pretty much similar, and I think that we will be slowly going to some level of convergence, hopefully. How far that can go, yeah, obviously I'm not suggesting that China might get on board anytime soon, especially when it comes to individual freedoms. But maybe apart from that, I think that there is great potential still in international work and dialogue on these issues.
Great, thank you. And Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I think as Jean-Yves and Anna's comments indicate, your deceptively simple question raises some of the really big issues that confront us over the next few years. Issues like data localization, the risk of walled gardens being established across the internet, the questions of things like intermediary liability for content and for data that is provided by their subscribers and users. All of these things are really significant issues, not just in terms of user trust, as we've been discussing, in data governance, but also their effect on the internet as a global and trusted and secure infrastructure accessible to everyone. I think one of the most interesting developments of GDPR, in my view, has been its extraterritorial applicability. In other words, the fact that it applies based on whose data it is, rather than where that data is. And I think that has had a number of very salutary effects around the world. So I see in the chat also there's a question from Lilia about what could be the vision for developing countries in this regard. And I see some developing countries looking at GDPR and thinking, you know what, actually, that's a pretty good approach for us too. And I think that's a good thing. My personal view, and I don't claim this is necessarily the Internet Society's view, is that we would do well to look again at the question of so-called sticky policy, that wherever my data goes, it should have some indication of the rules that apply to its use. Now, technically, that's pretty tricky to do. In policy terms, it may have some strange consequences, but I think we should be looking at it again. That's as I say, my personal view. So to drag this quickly back to my pet topic of today, the encryption debate, again, I think that's something that we face for the foreseeable future. Governments' push to gain access to encrypted data is not going to go away in a hurry, if at all. And so I foresee a long and difficult struggle there. But let me pick up again on the word balance, which has been used several times. I hope what people took away from my short introductory remarks was the fact that in any technical system, you still rely on some degree of procedural controls. No matter how good the lock is on my front door, if I leave my front door key on the doormat, the lock is of no use because anyone happening by can pick up the key and open the door. So along with the strength of the lock goes the reliability of my management of my front door keys. And we all understand that with physical keys. That's a mentality that we need to carry across to encryption as well. And in essence, when I described earlier that process for adding silent listeners to a call, essentially what that's saying is you go to the locksmith and you say, I've fitted new locks on my front door. Here's the key. please will you make a copy so that I can give one to my children? And he makes the copies for you and he hands them back and he says, there you go. And here's this other copy, which I'll just leave with the police station in case they ever want to get into your house. That would feel really weird. And yet that's what they're asking for with digital keys. So there is a point below which, if you start to mess with the technology, no amount of procedural safeguard can make up for what you've taken away. And that's where I think we are in some of the debates on encryption at the moment. And my mission personally over the next few years is to keep pushing back against that.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to pose Lilia's question to the others, but Anna, do you want to address the question about the access to the keys? I saw you nodding. I don't know if you want to, or you can answer Lilia's question about developing countries.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, as DPAs, we also obviously always note that encryption as such is mentioned several times in the GDPR in different contexts. So it has to be recognized that to a certain extent, the choice of the lawmakers in Europe has already been made to support its use and incorporate it as part of legal obligations, legal compliance obligations. Yes, I think that I agree that the discussions are probably still largely ahead of us and they will be complicated. But here again, I would hope that with sufficient presence of technical expertise, we will all be able to also explain to the lawmakers the implications of the nice words when they write in their resolutions, you know, that they would essentially want to have the cake, I mean, eat the cake and still have it, because this is what it boils down to today. But definitely this is going to still be a difficult discussion also here within Europe. And for the developing countries, this is what we see already to a certain extent happen, is a certain convergence towards, broadly speaking, the GDPR model. It's not always copy-paste of all the elements, but I think in terms of the future, also for a country that might then want to maybe seek adequacy finding in the near future to gain a competitive edge in terms of digital trade with European countries, obviously the closer they are able to come to the GDPR-like model, the more interesting the whole exercise becomes, and I guess that this is part of the what you call or some call Brussels effect. It happened in other areas of law and regulation in the past decades, and since a while we can maybe see something somewhat similar happening around data privacy regulations, and I can only think that you know, while GDPR is certainly like any legislation that is obviously always a result of a compromise, by and large, it's not a bad set of rules. Also, because the starting point there is really individual rights. It's not about state power. It's not strictly speaking about cybersecurity or any other bottom line. But the underlying values there are really the values of individual freedom, dignity, and control and respect for human rights. So I would indeed hope that more and more jurisdictions worldwide can kind of recognize themselves in this approach as opposed to some others and follow similar rules.
Thank you. Well, there used to be a US effect, but those days may be behind us for the time being. But Jean-Yves, do you want to take on the question also from Lilia about developing countries and your experience, or when they adopt GDPR or when you're using GDPR rules in the other countries? Has that been beneficial?
Well, yes. I mean, it's going to be like to be short. I fully agree with what Anna has just said. The way we see GDPR is that from a user perspective, it is, and I remember when the EU adopted the GDPR, I said, okay, now we are in the modern era. Now, this is something which is moved again from notice and consent to something which is adequate, appropriate for the digital era, when users go online and they don't know where their data is going. So that's why we have always been very supportive of GDPR. And when we talk about developing countries, I think, I fully agree with what Anna has just said. I mean, the closer we will see other governments come to the GDPR, the better. Now, GDPR is not the final answer to privacy. There are other things that need to be done. There are other ways for to engage with law enforcement agencies. Robin has been talking about encryption and giving the key to the police and saying, hey, if you want to come in my house, okay, now you don't do that. I mean, if you're serious about the right of your users, you don't give encryption keys to the authorities in the same way you don't share user data with other parties. These are things that are really, for me, and I think for the company, the basics, you know. So again, GDPR is a modern and, in my view, adequate regulation for the protection of users, and there are other things that need to be done by companies, by those that collect data from users with respect to the agencies. And again, what Robin was saying is absolutely right.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then I'll ask a kind of a wrap-up question. It was from an anonymous questioner asking about what you think about China's global initiative on data security. If you've followed that one. Jean-Yves.
I have not followed it, but I'm tempted to answer the way that a Chinese leader was reputed to have answered when a French president said, you know, we've had a revolution in France as well. What do you think of that? And he said, I think it's too early to tell.
Okay. All right. So I have one kind of wrap-up question, and we'll start with Anna this time. And that is, at the beginning, I said 22% of Swiss are using the Swiss COVID app, even though they and the previous speakers, and by the way, all the recordings will be online. We're working on it. Some of the professors at EPFL spent months working on the app, working with Google and Apple, working to make sure it was completely privacy protecting, of you know, only keeping a random number for us and matching up random numbers and not having any centralization. But that wasn't sufficient. People are still not downloading it about data protection concerns. And then we have the GDPR, which I think all three of you have agreed is a very modern, adequate, maybe not the last answer, as Jean-Yves just said, but a very strong approach. We have encryption, so a lot of the things that we get, you know, when you do a WhatsApp message, it says end-to-end encryption. There's the, you know, dashboard and other things for customers that Jean-Yves talked about, but nothing seems to be fully working to generate digital trust. And so just from the perspective of the users, what's your maybe number one, but what's the best approach to build up digital trust for users? So whether that's so that they'll trust the Swiss COVID app, or, you know, all the apps to get us out of this just a little bit faster, or the next time, and get more positive benefits out of the internet. What would be your approach to build on these tools, to inform people and to convince them that that their safety is higher than they clearly think? So Anna, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. It's difficult for me to comment on the specific situation in Switzerland, because I don't know, for example, whether there was any information campaign or promotional campaign for the use of this app. But I can share. I don't have the, well, I live in Belgium. I don't have the statistics for the Belgian app either. Last time I heard was, I don't remember the numbers, but it was better than some of the maybe pessimists have predicted. So, you know, not so bad in terms of uptake. But what struck me here in Belgium was the absolute lack of information or communication about this app, in particular from official channels. And to me, this speaks to a fairly basic point. You know, as regulators, advisors to the Commission services, members of the EDPB collectively and separately at national level have done a lot of work advising governments, issuing opinions, going through specifications, organizing workshops with researchers, with technical people, with the consortia that worked on developing those apps. We have talked to Apple and Google experts around the time when they were planning their initiative, you know, to integrate the apps in the operating systems. So a lot of groundwork has been done. A lot of compliance, I think, has been put into place. Maybe not to, you know, to perfection in all cases and in all aspects. And then my impression is that when the apps were ready to hit the market, there was absolute silence almost everywhere. So as if no one could just step up and say, you know, it's okay. We worked on this. And please use it because it's, you know, it's for the benefit of the community, and your risks are largely, if not completely eliminated, then reduced. And we vouch for this, you know, because we worked on it. And I think, you know, then we cannot be surprised that individuals are not keen to take the leap of faith and take an additional risk if every day or every other day they hear about data breaches, data sharing scandals, you know, hackers, and to a certain extent, well, thanks to the GDPR, maybe at least in part, we now have a greater awareness of the risks. So, you know, I think, I would hope that with a little bit of more clear communication and certain reassurance, this uptake could be better. And I certainly hope that we can work along these lines with the competent public health authorities and with other authorities to support them and the use and the development of these apps. And this is obviously not to suggest to issue just propaganda when there are issues, and sometimes there might be, depending on the specifics of a given implementation chosen. You know, this is not something that should be swept under the carpet. We need to be open and honest with the public. But I think that clearer communication about possible trade-offs and about the benefits of this to the public in particular, as well as to the individual, in terms of maybe better, more efficient fighting this pandemic, was completely missing in many places. And already with that, we could go a long way to improve that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know we learned in the last panel that even if you are tested in Switzerland, they don't tell you to download the app, so you may not have to come back. But just more broadly, Robin, if you can just build on what you just put in the chat about just more broadly building up a relationship between trust, technology, and belief.
Sure, absolutely, and I'll use immune status as an example because it's so present to our minds. I pick on 5 things here, and I'm not going to spend long on any of them. First, the data. Does the science make it possible to assert immune status? If you can't determine that from the scientific results, you can't assert it reliably. Second, how do you bind that assertion to the individual or the device? And we've been, Jean-Yves and others, and lots of people at Microsoft I know have been working on trustworthy assertions for as long as I have, a couple of decades. That's technically well understood, but it has roots of trust as well. So what are the roots of trust for this assertion? Are these assertions signed by a government agency? What's their role in this? Is it signed by a healthcare professional? Technically, how does that get into the system? Fourth, perception of threat. How do you bind those attributes to the individual, but still preserve that individual's privacy? And as you said, there's been a certain amount of work on pseudonymization of the results. But clearly, some solutions convinced users that their approach was valid. Others clearly did not convince users. And lastly, perverse consequences. Those have to be taken into account when you're writing the trust equation for this, because some people are going to look at immune status certificates and say, my overriding priority is how can I get immune status as quickly as possible so I can go back to work? And that will create some perverse incentives for those individuals.
Okay, thank you very much. Jean-Yves?
Yeah, very briefly, because I think what Robin was and Anna had been saying covers the full field. I think the way I see it is that, again, it is very much, as I mentioned earlier, it is very much a question of information. And as I was thinking a little bit of where we are in terms of privacy, data protection, the analogy to antitrust and competition came to my mind. This is something with which we have had since the 19th century, and it has evolved, and there is not full compliance with those principles, but everybody knows about that, and you have complaints every day, and people believe that generally, yes, there is competition. If there is not enough competition, we know where to complain. I think that with data protection ethics, but especially data protection, hopefully we are going to see the same thing. Maybe the adoption of the GDPR was the triggering event, and more countries are adopting similar regulation, and progressively people will understand the need to protect their data. It is, again, as we have all said, it is multi-stakeholder. We need the users to come with us, but in order for the users to be there, they need to be informed, they need to know, and that is something which it is taking time. We need to inform, and for me, the analogy to competition is that's something which I keep in mind.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Zoom has a lot of great features, but allowing everyone on a webinar to applaud for an excellent panel is not one of them, unfortunately, but thank you very much for your contributions. Excellent panel. And we are going to take a quick coffee break. We'll be back at 3:30 for the final session on the future of, even more about the future of data governance. And then the high-level panel will start immediately after that at 5 p.m. So thank you very much, and we'll see you back here in a bit. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.